Right, thanks. Right, Annie Kingsford and Annie Besant have infuriatingly similar first names. And I'm going to try to remember to call Besant Besant and Kingsford Kingsford. Normally I'd call them both by their first name, but it's problematical, isn't it? It can get very confusing which one I'd be talking about. You'll see that they were born very close together, and they're both rather pretty ladies. And they have other similarities. They got married in the same church a week apart, St Leonard's in near Hastings. And they obviously went to the same parish church. And they both married clergymen that they didn't live with. I mean, Annie Besant, much more dramatically than Kingsford, parted acrimoniously from her husband. But they were also the same social class. Annie Besant didn't have as much money as Kingsford, but she probably had more connections in the higher echelons of the Liberal Party. And here's one. St Leonard's. They've also got a connection with Harrow, because the males in the family, both families, had a tendency to go there. So there were possibilities for Kingsford and Besant to be friends when they were young women just about to get married, but there's no sign of them ever being friends. But it's almost impossible to believe in St Leonard's being as small as it is, and the parish of St Mary Magdalene, St Leonard's being even smaller, that they didn't come across one another. Right, I'm actually now going to talk a little bit on exactly the same thing that Muriel spoke on, because it's actually so important. The very, very first pamphlet that Kingsford wrote on when she was 21 and pregnant dealt with, she praised this incredibly controversial book. The Elements of Social Science, or Physical, Sexual and Natural Religion, an exposition of the true cause and only cure of the three primary social evils: poverty, well, I think we're all agreed, prostitution and celibacy. Now, most of us, I think, wouldn't see celibacy as one of the three great evils of the world. And it does sort of denote that Drysdale, George Robert Drysdale, who wrote it, had a particular view of the world. He wrote the book anonymously because it was just too hot to handle. He was actually a very well-connected man. His father, I think, was a baronet. Anyway, he was Sir somebody. And his sister and her husband ran a spa, very fashionable spa, which Darwin went to. And they weren't unknown people, the Drysdales. And he couldn't possibly write the name. He was a doctor. He couldn't possibly write the book under his own name. And I think the first time his name was associated was in 1904. But sort of, you sort of knew, if you were well connected, who'd written it. It was incredibly controversial. And for a young woman to come out and praise it was actually extraordinary. Now, it did have birth control bits in it. He was a great enthusiast for birth control. And it did have a very, very good understanding of women's whatever the word is. And it also put a great deal of emphasis on sexual pleasure. He actually blamed celibacy for so many of the evils of the world, wars, famines. It's all down to celibacy. It was a bad thing, and it was a bad thing for women to be celibate. And this was actually taken up by the radicals. Nobody thought of celibacy as being bad for women. They thought of it as being bad for men, but they hadn't thought about it being bad for women. And I really do think there's real importance in Kingsford writing this book at this time. It informs what happens in this early part of her life. What it's got to do with her later part is neither here nor there, because I'm actually going to concentrate on the early part of her life, really and truly, because the controversy she has with Annie Besant is in 1881. Now, at that time, Annie Besant, I'll come on to Annie Besant in a minute. Let's talk a little bit more about Kingsford. Kingsford made friends in London. Funnily enough, she often made friends with people connected or who would be connected to Annie Besant. The Drysdales were very close to Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh when she becomes a secularist, very, very close. They set up the Malthusian Society together. And you might not have heard the name Peter Taylor, MP, and his wife Clementina, very rich radicals. Kingsford goes to their house, their soirees. Again, there are people connected to Annie Besant and also Charles Bradlaugh. And Ladies' Own Paper. Now, it's interesting that Kingsford gets Frances Power Cobb. Now, Frances Power Cobb is the sort of big bug in anti-vivisection. And and that's the most important thing. Now, Frances Power Cobb famously doesn't like Kingsford very much, and there is tension in their relationship, and it's largely over Kingsford private life. Now, we don't actually know what Kingsford's private life is. We don't know whether she was celibate with the husband and with Maitland. We don't know, because we haven't been told. But certainly contemporaries were very suspicious that something that wasn't quite respectable was going on. And that's the reason Cobb didn't, one of the two reasons why Cobb wasn't very keen on Kingsford. And the other was that because Kingsford became a vegetarian. And Cobb thought this was so extreme that it would put vivisection, the anti-vivisection movement, it would make it look a bit ridiculous. So we are going to come back to this relationship. And I want to talk a little bit about the Ladies' Medical College. It's very difficult to talk about the Ladies' Medical College because there's been no book about it. There's a small little article that's come out in a brand new book that the Wellcome Society doesn't even have yet, which I haven't been able to get hold of. It was a very small organisation set up in 1864. It lasted till 1872, and it tried to train doctors, women doctors, and it failed. It only trained women midwives. But a lot of radical women were trained there. Well, not a lot, there were only about 20. But one of them was Florence Fenwick Miller. And she was a friend of, as we know, of Kingsford. And she was not a friend, because Annie Besant really doesn't have friends so much, but she was certainly an ally with Annie Besant over the birth control issue. And another person who was educated there was Dr. Francis Hogan. Dr. Francis Hogan was a big anti-vivisectionist, and another woman associated, well, it was just a little hotbed, but there were also rumours about it being associated with unwanted pregnancy, and it closed down in 1872. There is another woman, actually, who's, I'll come to her at the end, it might be better to talk about that. Alice Vickery, she's actually one of the Drysdales, Charles Drysdale's sort of wife. Interestingly, they didn't believe in marriage, so they didn't get married. They just pretended they were married. And I've never actually understood that. But anyway, she was the first woman to qualify as a chemist in Britain. And she's also another figure that is a crossover figure into Annie Besant's life and Anna Kingsford. And so there are these people that they know and differently like and get on with, but somehow they don't become friends. Now, in 1874, sorry, I have to have a drink. Sorry, only water. I need a drink, sounded really bad, didn't it? Right. In 1874, Anna Kingsford goes to the Paris Medical School, where she can actually train to be a doctor. She can't train in Britain yet. And Annie Besant has left her husband the year before, very acrimoniously, and she gets involved with Charles Bradlaugh. I would argue, and this is debated, I don't think they ever had a romantic entanglement or sexual relationship of any kind. But she gets involved with him, and she gets involved with the National Secular Society. Now, the National Secular Society still exists. It's a small little middle-class band, but at that time, it was the largest radical organisation in the country. And it's an interesting organisation. And obviously, it was atheist or free thought. They would call itself. But this chap, Bradlaugh, always calls himself an atheist Republican and a Malthusian. The people around him would often call themselves just free thinkers. But it was a big organisation. It had a massive London headquarters that seated 1,400 people. And it would often fill it. Bradlaugh would often fill it. Annie Besant would often fill it on a Sunday night. It had a provincial circuit for talking. And it had a weekly paper called the National Reformer, where you get to know that apart from promoting secularism, it was anti-vaccination, anti-the Contagious Diseases Act, yet it was pro-science, and it avoided the issue of vivisection. I've had great difficulty. It's not been digitalised, so I may, somebody may pop up soon and say, oh no, there was this article. But and I've been studying it for years, I haven't found anything that was I certainly haven't found Annie say anything that was pro-vivisection until 1879. Okay, now Annie Besant becomes famous. Annie Besant didn't become famous when she joined the National Secular Society. Bradlaugh was already famous. She became really famous when she stood trial for publishing a birth control pamphlet in 1877. And this is when Fenwick Miller supported her, and she got general support from radical women, but she didn't get support from liberal women. The Langham Place group were anti-contraception. Millicent Fawcett was very, very anti-contraception. So it was a real divide between radical women and liberal women. And so we come on to vivisection. What is vivisection? Well, I think we all know. That actually is not a face being vivisected, actually. It's a bit unfair. But anyway, vivisection has got a long history, and I'm not even going to report that. Ever since it's had a history, there have been people who thought it wasn't very nice. Okay? Now, in 1540, awful as he was, he didn't legalise vivisection, but he did legalise getting hold of bodies for dissection. And because, in a sense, there was no point in vivisecting animals, because vivisecting is about finding out the process, how things actually happen, the process. And they didn't know that much about how the human body just was, and, the actual content of the body, in a sense. They had to discover that. Now, Henry VIII allowed 4 bodies of criminals a year to be dissected. Now, that obviously indicates there wasn't a lot of dissection going on. And there wouldn't be. You didn't get that many people coming to be trained as doctors. And the way the system operated, they'd watch a dissection. Nobody sort of really thought about everybody having their own body to dissect. Now, this is the only dissection picture of a vivisection I'm going to show you. You'll be pleased to know. And it's William Harvey, his famous vivisection. This is a living dog, and I'm not going to actually go much into it, but he would demonstrate the circulation of the blood by getting a dog into this position and getting hold of basically almost something like a hammer type and just cutting it, and you would see where the blood went, and you'd see the circulation of the blood going round. I mean, it was horrific. And that's the only vivisection I'm going to speak about. But what is interesting about it is that he could actually just use a normal implement. You didn't need special surgical instruments to do this. I mean, it's such a famous experiment, and yet it could be done by something that you've got in the house. You don't need special equipment to do it. And interestingly enough, at this time, we're getting the idea of Descartes, and the idea that, animals are autonomous. They don't really matter. And it's interesting that this idea should develop in philosophy. Just when there's the beginnings of, I would say, mass vivisection, the very beginnings. Now, obviously, most people didn't go by that. That's a picture of Lord Byron's type of dog. Most people felt very sympathetic to animals, especially the ones that they owned, but they were practical. I mean, when you think about slaughterhouses in the early 18th century, you would, these were brutal times. But Murder Act 1752, they came up with the wonderful idea that actually basically any criminal that had committed a bad enough crime could actually now be dissected. And that was because medical schools were developing and the whole, the medical industry in a sense was slowly developing. And you actually got Wilberforce. He sort of thought that everybody should be dissected, that, you know, any criminal at all. So, I mean, he's very, very liberal in some things, but not in others. And we get it dissection into vivisection. Now, dissection is one thing. Lots of people sort of went, you're a bit uffy, I wouldn't like to do it. Vivisection is another. And John Hunter is the crossover figure, the big crossover figure, into wanting to vivisect. And it was really, there was a leap in the amount of people who wanted to study medicine and physiology, but there was also a development in surgical instruments. And it's as early as, oh gosh, no, that is 1757, I do apologise. And here we actually have, you know, vivisection is suspected. People don't actually really know 100% that it's going on, but there's a beginning of a suspicion that these medical schools were carrying out vivisections on animals, and there is a feeling that people don't like it. But why did nothing happen about it? Why did nothing happen? Well, if you look at the second part of the 18th century, there is a lot of competing injustices to look at. You know, there's, you know, the way they actually butcher animals, they have slavery, they still actually the last person to be hanged, drawn and quartered officially in England was, you know, 1782. So there's a lot of competing injustices. However, what is written by non-doctors about vivisection is hostile. Now we get here in the 1830s, there's a flurry of reforms, and there begins to be a Cruelty to Animals Act. There's beginning to be a feeling that we should be nice to animals. But a little bit before that, we actually get this chap and this one. Bell and Francois Magendie. Now Charles Bell, his experiments, this is very interesting. And it shows the sort of Magendie's experiments were no more horrific than Charles Bell's. Bell's palsy. He did horrific experiments on animals, but nobody seems to know. Not even Kingsford, Anna Kingsford or Annie Besant seem to know. Somehow he miraculously did all his work on facial nerves without doing any vivisection. But this chap, who's a foreigner, began to be known and began to be written about. He came to England and did some dreadful public experiment with a greyhound, which was probably, Charles Bell never made any mistake like that, but Franz Magendie was more sort of, you know, open and out about it. And he actually sort of, vivisection became more visible at the time of Francois Magendie. I think it was 1824 when he came to England. And so vivisection began to be associated with France. You know, and this is just after the Napoleonic Wars, and so obviously the French, well, they're appalling, aren't they? So of course they'd do something like that. And then the Germans. And it wasn't associated as much. There was a sort of, doctors sort of denied things, let us say. And then we come to this wonderful august organisation. I think we know that it's the University College London. Lots of vivisection going on there. But it's not called vivisection, it's called practical physiology. I mean, if you actually looked at the calendar of the students, what they get up to, you wouldn't know that it was, you know, vivisection became a normal part. It became a normal part of medical training. However, it was an optional subject. And you would find that sort of maybe 120 students would turn up for anatomy and dissection, but only about 30 a year would turn up for practical physiology. One of them was Westcott Wynne. He did Wynne Westcott? He actually did, yeah, he actually did. He was enrolled in a practical physiology course with, we'll come on to that. He only did it for 1 year, and a chap we're coming on to in a minute did it every possible year, and he didn't pay for the extra service, which was access to the physiological laboratory at any time to vivisect any animal that you happened to come across. Right, now these two guys are the French apostles of vivisection. We know about Claude Bernard, and we know about Paul Bert. Claude Bernard wrote a book in 1869 which was published, translated into English, where he sort of said, you know, the physiologist. Physiologist was the word that was used for a doctor or a researcher who vivisected. They didn't call themselves vivisectors, they called themselves physiologists. It's a code word. And he said, well, the physiologist doesn't see the blood or the pain. He's a man of science looking for truth and answers and stuff. But these are the two guys, the British apostles of vivisection. Now, I know more about University College London than I do about other places, so I'm going to talk about that. But Sir John Burden Sanderson, his wife, incidentally, was with the Langham people, and this chap, they dominated at UCL, and they were doing massive amount of vivisections. But nobody really knew. They suspected there was, you know, the anti-vivisection movement is growing, but it's sort of like hearsay. They're not really coming out of the woodwork. And then the vivisecting community, if you can call it that, had an own goal. And they published something called the Handbook for the Physiological Laboratory, which was Burden Sanderson, Foster, and a couple of other people. One of them was Emmanuel Klein. And they published this book quite, you know, just for students, and it detailed the most horrific experiments, about 600 pages, lots of pictures, and the anti-vivisection movement really got into gear. It was just too obvious. They'd broken cover. They'd actually done an own goal. They hadn't realised it. They so lived in their own world that though they knew there was an anti-vivisection movement, never really thought that they'd be able to do anything. And in a way they couldn't. Except Gladstone was no longer in power. Gladstone was definitely for the pro-vivisectionists. Actually, Disraeli was also for the pro-vivisectionists, because British science has to be as good as German and French science. And, you know, but he was more Machiavellian. And he set up a royal commission into vivisection. And he passed a law, the first Cruelty to Animals Act, the first anti-vivisection law in the whole wide world. And it banned students from being able to vivisect as part of their coursework just in order to observe a process for themselves which was already known, while researchers who wanted to vivisect animals for purposes of original research had to get a license from the Home Office. These were the two big changes. There wasn't an inspectorate, funnily enough. There was a sort of couple of people who were to look at these things, but anyway, it was a bit of a dead letter. And here we get a chap that comes into the National Secular Society and I think influences Annie Besant very strongly on this particular issue, because he was a graduate of the University College London. He had done he'd chosen to do practical physiology every single year. He'd actually paid the extra money to be able to use the laboratory when he wanted to for, you know, other experiments. And he was a great defender of vivisection. And he joins the National Secular Society at the end of 1878 and starts writing for it in 1879, and he becomes a vice chair. Now, and it's interesting, very soon, oh gosh, sorry. Very soon after Aveling associates himself with the National Secular Society, you get Annie Besant defending David Ferrier, Dr. David Ferrier. Dr. David Ferrier did some horrific experiments. I'm sure they gave wonderful information, there's no doubt, marvellous information, but it was also on monkeys. He was a brain specialist, and he published his researches. And she defended the book. Now, he was hugely controversial. He wasn't somebody nobody had heard of. And so when Annie Besant decided to defend David Ferrier in the National Reformer, everybody knew what he was doing. I mean, it was something that she could have ignored if she wanted to. There was no great need for Annie Besant to write a review of this book, but she did, and she defended him very, very thoroughly. And this is when Annie and Annie clash. And it was a mental fencing match. I love that little picture. Can I have a sip of water? This is the bit you've been waiting for. Okay, where am I? Where am I? Let me find it. Wouldn't it be awful if I'd left my notes at home? Oh, no, I haven't. That's good. So I want to do the right. Right, well, Annie, the debate came up, Annie, because there was a private member's bill, Eardley Wilmot, I think his name was, to actually make improvements on the 1876 Anti-Vivisection Act because it wasn't working very well. And so Annie Besant comes into to defend, and she does it, these are the dates, on the 4th and the 11th of September, she writes pro-vivisection articles. The 25th of September, she puts in Anna Kingsford's anti-vivisection letter, and October the 16th, Annie Besant has the last word. So there's 3 of Annie's to one of... now, Annie is she's not the editor, but she's so close to the editor, Charles Bradlaugh, that she might as well have been. Right, Besant argues that suppressing vivisection, simply because it causes pain to the animal, prevents the discovery of cures, and so will increase the overall pain suffered by animals as well as men. Okay? She actually refers to Harvey, which is why I mentioned him in the first place. She refers to Harvey, and that how the circulation of the blood would not have been found without Harvey's experiments. Now, Annie does concede that present-day students should not carry out experiments merely to observe already understood phenomena for themselves, but she argues very much against the state control of bona fide researchers as it gave power over scientists to ignorant officials. And this is very much actually a theme in the National Secular Society. They, bureaucracy, they don't like bureaucracy. And then she praises the morality and ethical standards of doctors and states that the infliction of pain is not the criterion of the cruelty of an action. That's very much what Besant says very emphatically. And she cites surgery as being painful but not cruel. And then she attacks anti-vivisectionists for being religious, cites cruelty in nature, then she talks of the pain of slaughterhouses and hunting and angling. And how can the infliction of cruelty for food or sport be permissible but not for science? She counts herself as one not blinded by prejudice, as are the anti-vivisectionists. Okay, September the 11th, Annie Besant continues with a much longer article. She argues the necessity of vivisection and its proven value. And the experiments, she says, are essential for scientific progress. If not on animals, there would be obviously experiments on man, and that would be the poor. And why should animals be protected but not, and man sacrificed? Again, she defends Harvey as a great vivisectionist, and she also defends the experiments of Sir Charles Bell, which she obviously doesn't really know anything about. And I don't attack her for that. It's something that Kingsford doesn't either, from the other position, and it's obvious he was very good at keeping secrets. Then she defends David Ferrier, and she defends Lister, as well as several European doctors, including Pasteur. Okay, she thinks anti-vivisectionists are against scientific progress, but she argues again and again that if the research on animals are banned, doctors will experiment on the poor. She doesn't seem to understand that maybe that could be controlled as well. And then she pleads that she loves animals because she's got pets. And sums it up and pleads for science as a benefactor of mankind. And if you actually read the articles, they do flow. Annie Besant could write, there's no doubt about it. And it's, you go with the flow, and it's perhaps afterwards that you might not agree with what she's said. Anna Kingsford replies. Now, they publish her reply. We don't know if they published the entire reply, and we don't know how many replies Anna Kingsford may have made. To all we know, she'd written in after September the 4th article. We don't know. We just know. And actually, the Anna Kingsford reply is much shorter than Annie Besant's arguments. And then the first thing she says, Anna Kingsford, I do not appear as an advocate of the clerical party. For me, the orthodox priest is the enemy of the human race. But then she says that she thinks that Annie Besant has turned the wolf out of doors to go to bed with the jackal. I don't know, I like that, I'm going to use it at some point. Okay, but this is what she meant. You secularists have rejected ecclesiastical priests and his gospel of redemption by means of the suffering and cruel death of the innocent, only to accept with open hands the same self-same doctrines formulated by a new priest of science. And she says Besant had said the infliction of pain is not the test of cruelty, and illustrates this by describing operations. But operations, Kingsford said, they benefit the people, or at least they're supposed to, benefit the people who undergo them. While what Besant is actually advocating, she says, Kingsford says, is vicarious suffering. And how can somebody advocate vicarious suffering while they say that they are secularists? Kingsford also defends herself as a vegetarian and as an opponent of hunting, and points out that the anti-vivisectors are also at the forefront, not just herself, but all of them are at the forefront of attacking cruel sports. And the reason we concentrate on vivisections is because it is the worst cruelty. It's organised, it's systematic, the most ferocious of all the forms of the Hydra. And she really uses the argument that is used that actually, even when the animal goes into the slaughterhouse, it doesn't know it suspects it's going to die, but it's not quite sure. Like the bull that goes into the bull ring, it thinks, oh, I'm in trouble here, but he still thinks there's a good chance he can kill himself out of it. And so the argument is that, you know, with when you're tied up like that, there's obviously, you've got no hope. And then actually, Kingsford denies the scientific value of vivisection. Now remember, she's writing in 1881. Now you might argue that later on there has been, we can come to that. But she says, but Kingsford says, she starts with Harvey, because Annie Besant started with Harvey, and she says that the circulation of the blood could have been worked out without these horrific cruelties to dogs, because observing the valves in dissection would actually tell you what was actually, you could work out what was actually happening here. And in fact, arguably, Harvey had already worked out that this circulation must be going on because of the valves when he actually proved it. So in fact, he proved something that he'd actually worked out, and he wasn't the first, apparently. Then she sort of says Sir Charles Bell, he didn't vivisect very much, and here she's clearly unaware of the extent of what Bell does. And then she says, well, Ferrier's work has also been challenged by his brother vivisectors. And anyway, she says, if benefits are to be gained in these terms, then then they're not worth happening. They're not worth it. And then we get, so that's her reply. Then Mrs. Besant defends vivisection in a smaller article in Daybreak on October the 16th. I had not intended to reply to Dr. Kingsford's letter against my articles on vivisection, as the answer seemed so obvious, but several friends asked me to say a word on it. Dr. Kingsford appears to argue that the infliction of pain on animals is only justifiable when the animal who suffers the pain is individually benefited by the infliction. My answer to this is that if Dr. Kingsford's principle was carried out, human civilization and progress would be arrested. Pain is continually inflicted on animals purely for human advantage. If it were not so, the domestication of animals would be impossible. Pain is inflicted on every horse that is broken in, and the ordinary use of male horses in the street would be dangerous without the previous infliction of an extremely painful operation. If it be wrong to inflict pain on an animal for human advantage, Dr. Kingsford would never drive in a cab. Most especially, and then she goes on, if we carried out Dr. Kingsford's principle, we should be driven off the earth by the lower animals. As for Harvey and his discoveries, in his own words, are plain, and he did experiment, and that very largely on living animals. Sir Charles Bell, whether he regretted it afterwards or not, tied up the several roots of the spinal nerves and thereby made the discovery which has rendered his name immortal. Bell's palsy. Interestingly, there is still no cure for Bell's palsy. We know what did it because of the experiments on animals. We know what it's caused by, but we still haven't got a cure. It is fortunate for humanity that he discovered his facts before they felt scruples as to the means. It is not to be expected in novel and difficult brain experiments like Ferrier's. Every result will be first wholly reliable. Still, the fact remains that while Professor Ferrier may have and probably has drawn some wrong conclusions, he has yet restored taste and smell, and he talks about an example of how his work has helped. Dr. Kingsford's appeal to the emotions because of the cries, sobs and moans from a laboratory scarcely goes far enough. The power of the realization of sufferings by the scientist does not depend on his ear alone. He hears the cries and sobs and moans going up not only from the laboratory, but from the world, and seeks to save millions from pain while inflicting it on units. And then she goes on, Monsieur Pasteur heard the groans of dying animals in every land, and they drowned the groans of the comparatively few on whom he operated. Right. And so we go on. So that's the debate. That's the debate, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if Anna Kingsford didn't reply back to that, but she didn't it wasn't published. I think it's very unlikely that she didn't reply back to it. Anyway, Cobb, incidentally, tries to prosecute David Ferrier in November 1881, but fails. The logic of the Act, the Cruelty to Animals Act, would have been that he was found guilty. If he had been found guilty, he would have been fined something like 10 shillings. Right, and now we get back to Annie's good friend, Dr. Aveling. In April 1882, in vivisection, he reports that his private laboratory, where he gives classes for National Secular Society students, adult students, has been invaded, has been inspected by the RSPCA. And he very much, in this article, attacked not only the anti-vivisectionists for reporting him, for carrying out vivisections without a licence. The whole tenor of all the articles in the National Reformer after that are very in his favour of vivisection. And he very much rails against the idea that bona fide researchers, scientific researchers, should need to have a licence as if they were publicans. So it's very much, and the people who care about the animals, they're Bestarians, they care about animals more than people. So the National Reformer remains, after the debate, Annie Besant doesn't move an inch. She is still, and this is actually quite an interesting case. The dog that didn't bark. There was a big, I think it was 1882, November 1882, the Lancet reported uncritically research carried out by Sir Sidney Ringer and William Murrell. Now, William Murrell was actually a friend of Aveling's, and Sir Sidney Ringer had been one of his teachers at UCL, and they carried out research on a poison. I'm trying to find the name of the poison here. I'll find it in a minute. I'll find it later. On a bunch of unsuspecting patients at Westminster Hospital. And they're all very sick and all very ill and all very frightened. And they just report in the Lancet, you know, just how interesting this is. That again was taken up by the anti-vivisectionists, because one of the arguments is, we must have vivisection, which they were still having, because nobody, it seems, that applied for a Home Office licence to vivisect was refused. So they were still carrying out vivisection, because obviously they're also doing experiments on people. Now, this was huge. But Aveling, who was actually the science correspondent for the National Reformer, didn't mention it. And so it's the dog that didn't bark. He wasn't going to be able, nobody was going to be able to defend it in radical or liberal circles. You couldn't defend these poisoning about 25 patients at the Westminster Hospital, but silence was preferred. While later on, as late as 1885, in Annie Besant's Our Corner, she publishes The Ethics of Vivisection by her new friend John Mackinnon Robertson, where he attacks Cobb, as he calls her the wrathful controversialist, and Kingsford was the facile sociolist, not to be confused with socialist. It just means somebody who thinks they've got an education, but obviously are pig ignorant compared to me. And he uses the argument basically, I mean, it's an interest, and he's so conceited, this guy. But he uses the argument at the end, well, anti-vivisectionists, they're so phony, because, I mean, I bet you they go and kill mice if they've got them in their kitchen. So but what I want to point out from that is that Annie Besant hasn't been changed by the debate. She hasn't become an anti-vivisectionist, and this is as late as 1885. Now, when exactly Annie Besant decided not to be pro-vivisection anymore, we don't know. But she did print a mea culpa in her autobiographies. And I want to look at that because she actually, in her autobiography, says a few things that are not true. And the first one is, she said, I limited my approval to highly skilled men engaged in original investigations. Well, perhaps because she said that, students shouldn't. And she sort of, and I took the representations made of the character of the experiments without sufficient to verify them, probably true. And I inserted her replies. He does refer to Kingsford, which actually, and I think this whole piece published in her biography in 1893 is very much because Anna Kingsford's reputation grew after death. She's actually having to put that I did publish Anna Kingsford's replies. I'm not, and she said, her full replies, but I'm not so sure that she did that. But then she makes the last little point, number 4, not quite the last one, and it was like, I'd actually thought all the terrible things were happening outside England. I hadn't realised these things were going on here, which was, rather tendentious because she knew about Ferrier. And then she says, it was a partial defence. So she's extricating herself from ever having, everybody knew that she had supported vivisection. That couldn't be hidden. It was too well known. But she extricates herself from why she had. Now, if you've been able to go back to the National Reformer, if you had copies of the National Reformer, you could see that wasn't quite the truth. But most people didn't keep copy. I mean, do you keep copies of every paper that you buy? No, you throw them away. And there wasn't, as Muriel said, there wasn't the access to archives. It was actually, well, even now when there is access to archives, people can sort of change the truth a bit. But you have to have energy to go and change, to go and look things up. And there weren't the archives. So, but anyway, what's indicative of about that, I think, is that by the mid-90s, Annie Besant could no longer defend having defended vivisection. And I want to end with Anna Kingsford. Anna Kingsford was consistent. She was a consistent vegetarian. She was a consistent anti-vaccinationist, and she attacked in her last few years. She attacked Pasteur. Now, there's been a general sort of feeling that, because Pasteur did all these wonderful things and discovered the cure for rabies, that really she must have been completely wrong. Now, but it turns out that Pasteur's, his laboratory notes were handed over by, I think it was his son or great-nephew, in 1964, to whoever they're handed over to in France, the place you hand things over to. And of course, they're massive. It's, they'd fill this room. And so it's taking a long time to look at them. But what has come out is that the accusations that Anna Kingsford made against Pasteur, the number of people who actually died from the rabies vaccine after being vaccinated, well, anyway, she has been her attacks are vindicated. Though if you read the book, the great new book that's about Pasteur and his work, based on what's come out from the workbook so far, Anna Kingsford isn't mentioned. So it's not like this is a vindication of Anna Kingsford. But she is. The detailed attacks that she made in the press, which were hooted at the time, she was right. And, on balance, I quite like her. That's it.